Hi, my name is Amy Anderson, and I am here to welcome you to the Ideas That Matter series hosted by Regent College. Just as a note, we had a bit of a technical glitch in the live recording, but happily all we lost was my introduction and about 30 seconds of Malcolm's talk. So you won't miss anything important, but this introduction is being re-recorded. Regent College is a graduate school of theology that equips the whole people of God for thoughtful theological engagement in all walks of life. The Ideas That Matter series cultivates theological engagement with cultural issues that are particularly pressing right now. Our next event is Reimagining Belonging, Race and Place in Christian Communities with David Leong on December 9th. You can access it at rgnt.net/live, or you can watch it after the fact on our YouTube profile. So we hope to see you there. Today, we're asking about the value of the arts in a time of crisis. Why do poetry and literature matter when the world seems to be burning around us, both literally and figuratively? Why should we pay attention to poets when there are significant needs at every turn? We're privileged to be exploring these issues with Dr. Malcolm Guite, who is a poet, priest, and a scholar who's giving thought to these important questions. Malcolm serves as chaplain of Girton College in Cambridge. He teaches for the Divinity faculty in Cambridge, and he lectures widely in England and North America on theology and literature. He's the author of numerous books and works of poetry, and we're looking forward to a new book from him in January called David's Crown, which is a meditation on the Psalms. Watch for that book, published by Canterbury Press, end of January. So without further ado, join me in welcoming Malcolm Guite for his lecture, Poetry Pushes Back, the Practical Power of Poetry to Rebalance Our Lives.
Although, as W.H. Auden very famously said, poetry makes nothing happen, in that it doesn't executively command events to happen. That nevertheless, poetry offers us, particularly in crisis, a series of gifts, of insights, of reappraisals of ourselves and our world, glimmerings of hope, moments of vision that can redirect our whole lives. And there's another famous statement about poetry. There are two one-liners about poetry that often get quoted, and they apparently mean two opposite things. The Auden one I've just mentioned, poetry makes nothing happen. And of course, very famously, Shelley's, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. That poetry in that sense makes almost everything happen, that poetic insight lies behind so much else that makes for human flourishing. So I'm going to, as it were, pivot, if I may, between those two sayings. And in order to understand, and then I'm going to bring forward from the pivot and through the work of Seamus Heaney, and then finally some of my own, I'm going to make the case for the practical importance of poetry. But in order to get a hold of those two famous sayings, Shelley's poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, and Auden's poetry makes nothing happen, we really need to understand the context of both. We need to know why Shelley could make such a large claim for poetry. And we also need to look at what exactly Auden was meaning. It's a very odd thing for a poet to say, poetry makes nothing happen. It's like, my whole life has been pointless. And I think as soon as we see the context and the wider and larger things, the specific way he uses that line and the way he comes back against his own line in the poem In Memory of W.B. Yeats that it's come from, we'll see the context. Context, as you know, if you're a biblical scholar, context is everything. So let's have a look at the Shelley. I've just given you the golden passage that leads up towards it. Perhaps we could see that on the screen now. I'm going to read it to you as well, but I thought you might like to actually see it. So here's Shelley talking about the power of poetry and the gifts that it offers us. So he says this, I'm sure the text will be with you in a minute. Here it is. But poetry acts in another and diviner manner. It awakens and enlarges the mind itself by rendering it the receptacle of 1,000 unapprehended combinations of thought. So there's poetry Notice he uses the word divine. There's something spiritual and given about it. And its job is to wake up your mind and then to enlarge the capacity of mind, awakens and enlarges. And look at that, interesting. It gives you images by which you can get your unapprehended combinations of thought. He's riffing on Shakespeare there, when Shakespeare said that imagination apprehends more than cool reason ever comprehends. So then he goes on to say, poetry lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world and makes familiar objects to be as if they were not familiar. It reproduces all that it represents. And the impersonations, clothed in its Elysian light, stand thenceforward in minds who have once contemplated them as memorials of that gentle and exalted content which extends itself over all thoughts and actions. So it not only shows you these things, but it expresses them so beautifully that that momentary content, that point where you did have a vision, is not lost like peripheral vision. Oh, I saw it, but I can't remember what it was. It doesn't disappear, because you can return to the poem. And there it is, golden and glowing and gone. Let's go on to see what he says next. And here he switches from the way it enlarges and awakens your mind to get right to the heart of things, which is our moral life. And he has, I think, one of the greatest, this ought to be as widely quoted as one sentence as the unacknowledged legislators. The great secret of morals is love. Now, Shelley claimed to be an atheist, but you don't have to look far to see where he got the idea that the great secret of morals is love. These are the two greatest commandments that Jesus tells us, to love God and love your neighbor. But then how do we love? The great secret of morals is love, or beautifully expressed, a going out of our nature and an identification of ourselves with the beautiful, which exists in thought, action, or person, not our own. A man to be greatly good must imagine intensely and comprehensively. He must put himself in the place of another or of many others, and the pains and pleasures of his species must become his own. The great instrument of moral good is the imagination, and poetry administers to the effect by acting upon the cause. That's brilliant. That's absolutely brilliant. So you've got to love. And in order to love, you have to have an enlarged imagination. You have to be able to imagine yourself in somebody else's shoes. You have to have some sense of feeling the pains and pleasures of the whole of humanity. And if we are to get out of this immediate COVID crisis, as we're discovering now with foolish pricing of vaccines, unless we understand that unless all of us is safe, none of us is safe. And in the end, unless all of us has an environment that's fit to live in, then in the end, none of us will have. We have to be able to go out and imagine and see things from other people's point of view. And that's exactly what Shelley says poetry does. So he then goes on to say, poetry enlarges the circumference of the imagination by replenishing it with thoughts of ever new delight, which have the power of attracting and assimilating to their own nature all other thoughts, which form new intervals and interstices. Poetry strengthens the faculty, which is the organ of the moral nature of man, in the same manner as exercise strengthens a limb. Isn't that interesting? I mean, we've all been keeping fit during lockdown and exercising our bodies for fear that they should atrophy. Poetry exercises your soul and your heart and your moral imagination and allows you, it enlarges your mind. And you can do that in lockdown too. Poetry strengthens the faculty, just as exercise strengthens a limb. And then comes the famous saying, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Now you can see why he said it. Now you can see that the role he gives to poetry, and it's not just poetry here, this would be equally true of novels, it would be true of the dramatic arts, it would be true of good film, that it takes you out of yourself, enlarges and expands and awakens your mind and gives you this capacity to have a moral response, a loving response, an insightful response into somebody else's life, because you can begin to see it from their perspective, as well as awakening you to nature. So there's a bit of context for Shelley, if you like, making the case for the defense for poetry. Indeed, the book from which I'm quoting is simply called The Defense of Poetry. It was written at the beginning of the 19th century, just as Britain was about to go into, if you have a little tea, into a severe period of utilitarianism where it was asking exactly, oh, you know, if it doesn't add to the pounds, shillings and pence, and if I can't see the concrete fruits of it in my hand, it's no good. And Shelley saw that coming and said, no, in the end, everything that makes your life worth living is going to be dependent on how you combine love and imagination. So why then, in the early to mid 20th century, in a poem that was published in 1939, does Auden say, poetry makes nothing happen? And indeed, does he really say it? Let's have a little look at that. The passage comes from the middle section of a poem in 3 parts. We won't have time to read it all, but it's a very fine poem called In Memory of W.B. Yeats. Just to give you a taste of it, let me give you the first stanza. He disappeared in the dead of winter. The brooks were frozen, the airports almost deserted, and the snow disfigured the public statues. The mercury sank in the mouth of the dying day. What instruments we have agree, the day of his death was a cold, dark day. And then there are a few more verses still in part 1 after that. It's beautiful, chill scene setting. And there's a wonderful thing where he says, his poems didn't know he died. The death of the poet was kept from his poems, and his poems carried on flourishing. Then comes another verse I'd like to draw to your attention. Now he is scattered among 100 cities and wholly given over to unfamiliar affections, to find his happiness in another kind of wood and be punished under a foreign code of conscience. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. That's a very powerful line of poetry. I'm quoting the words of 2 dead men, Shelley and Auden, and yet they've become part of who I am, part of who we are, these famous sayings, and they take on a new resonance and a new significance as we read them in our own age. So that's a little bit of the evocative, elegiac part 1 of this poem. But of course, the quotation that everybody knows, even if they don't know the poem, poetry makes nothing happen, comes in part 2. So let's have a little look at the crucial part in part 2. Here he's addressing Yeats. I must say, he says poetry made nothing happen. He would never have dared to say that to late Yeats when he was living. My goodness, Yeats would have had a reply to that. But here's what he says, and this is the context for the saying. Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. Now Ireland has her madness and her weather still, for poetry makes nothing happen. It survives in the valley of its making, where executives would never want to temper, flows on south from ranches of isolation and the busy griefs, raw towns that we believe and die in. It survives a way of happening, a mouth. Very extraordinary thing. Now, just let's look at this. At one level, he's saying, well, Yeats may have written brilliant poetry, but Ireland is as troubled now, he calls it Mad Ireland, as it was when he wrote, and the weather is just what it is. Did the poetry change anything? Well, actually, I think in the case of Yeats, he's skating on pretty thin ice there. I think the whole Irish literary revival, the Abbey Theatre, the power in the end of Yeats's Easter 1916, you know, about the Easter Rising, A Terrible Beauty is Born, those all went into the making of Irish history as well as just Irish poetry. But Auden offers an interesting image here. When he says poetry makes nothing happen, he immediately follows that on by contradicting it almost, by saying it survives. And then comes a submerged and beautiful metaphor that he never quite names, but it's clear and it's flowing through the poem, and that is the metaphor of a river flowing from the high, if you like, inspired mountain hills where it's born, out towards the rest of us in the cities. See, it survives in the valley of its making. The executive has said never go up there, but it flows on south. It flows towards our busy griefs. It flows through our towns. It survives, and look at that, it's a way of happening, a mouth. And of course, the word mouth is an extension both of the river metaphor, the river flowing to its mouth in the sea, but also the idea that of the mouth, the oracular mouth that speaks, that this poetry, which may not have made something happen in the way an executive can make something happen, nevertheless flows through us and reaches the mouth and gives an expression that we might not otherwise have. And indeed, if we now look at the third part of this great poem in memory of Yeats, where he blesses Yeats and sees Yeats's poetry as doing great things beyond the Yeats's grave, he actually ends up telling you, just as Shelley did, what poetry is really for. So this is what he says. These are the last three verses of the poem. Follow, poet, right to the bottom of the night with your unconstraining voice. Still persuade us to rejoice. With the farming of a verse, make a vineyard of the curse. Sing of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress. In the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start. In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise. Now, if we just take that last stanza, the very last stanza of the poem, in which he famously says, poetry makes nothing happen. And look at this. Here's something. It may not be a happening in the sense that it's a recordable event you could see out there in the streets with a camcorder, but it's the most deeply transformative of inner happenings. And if there were ever a happening that needed to happen now, not just in September of 1939 when he wrote this poem, then it's this final verse. Have we not, all of us in this terrible isolation, the way we've been bereft of our loved ones, the way sometimes when people have died, we haven't been able to go to funerals, the way we've been shrunk back, as it were, from our wide encounter with the world into a kind of inner wilderness and desert. What does Auden's poem say? In the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start, never more needed than now. And then this brilliant final couplet. In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise. Now, there's a paradox. He's in prison, the prison of his days. We're in the prison of time. We're in all kinds of prisons. And yet there is this radical freedom. Indeed, as Christians, we would say, and Auden was a Christian, where the Spirit of God is, there is freedom. That even in these sad constraints, we have freedom. And within that freedom, we have the power to praise. And if I were to just if I reduce the whole poem to just 2 lines, to its final 2 lines, I wish these 2 lines were as much, if not more, remembered than that 1 line, poetry makes nothing happen. If I were to sum up what I thought poetry was about in 2 lines, it would be these 2. In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise. Well, we'll leave Auden and Shelley behind, and indeed Yeats behind now for a minute, and move on to our own time. That was then and this is now. Perhaps to mediate before we get to the immediate contemporary situation, in which I'm going to reflect with you a little bit about my own role as a poet and the way I see poetry pushing back and redressing a balance. I'd like to get us there via another Irish poet, since Auden was writing about Yeats. Well, Yeats's great successor, without question, is the Nobel laureate Seamus Heaney, about whose poetry I've had the happiness of lecturing in Regent. So Heaney published, I think, a very important collection of essays, which were the lectures he gave when he was Oxford Professor of Poetry. He published them under the title The Redress of Poetry. And at the core of Heaney's account of poetry there is this notion of redressing an imbalance, that he felt that the highly material, competitive, ultra reductive, rational way that we see things, where things aren't really given credit unless they're literally credit-worthy monetarily, or aren't given a sense of reality unless there's something you can see, under a microscope, or, have a physical reckoning of, that these intangibles, these great subtle things, that actually help us to see all things were being neglected. And he felt that poetry redressed that balance. Let me just give you a few phrases just short phrases from those essays. They're so important, I think. So Heaney says in the introduction to The Redress of Poetry, and these are Heaney's words, poetry offers a clarification, a fleeting glimpse of a potential order of things beyond confusion, a glimpse that has to be its own reward. The poem provides a draught of the clear water of transformed understanding and fills the reader with a momentary sense of freedom and wholeness. You notice that sense of freedom again. I love that. It's a modest claim. It's not a completely all transfiguring and permanent vision. Maybe nothing can offer us that until the last day, but it's a glimpse. And sometimes a glimpse is all you need. I mean, Heaney famously in one of his poems, right at the height of the Troubles, says to himself about writing poetry, compose in darkness, expect aurora borealis in the long foray, but no cascade of light. And he is a great poet of the sort of gleanings and glimmerings of light. But he also says in The Redress of Poetry that a poet can construct something imaginary, a shape, a poem, a play, which, whilst it doesn't exist in the real world, has a series of, as it were, coordinates and connections with the real world, such as that when we visited the poem's reality, we come back to our own with a new purchase on it, a new grip, a new way of seeing things. Heaney puts it like this in his prose. As long as the coordinates of the imagined thing correspond to the world we live in and endure, poetry is fulfilling its counterweighting function. It can become another truth to which we can have recourse, before which we can know ourselves in a more fully empowered way. So the imagined thing actually gives you purchase on the real thing, and it's a counterbalancing weight. Now, it happens that we've got a very good example in Seamus Heaney's own work of exactly that thing happening. Heaney taking something that you would think be the most impractical, recherche, obscure little thing you could think of and writing it in the middle of the Troubles, and actually it doing exactly that pushback. And the thing I'm talking about is a version. He doesn't call it a translation, it's almost a remaking, a version of a very obscure Greek tragedy by Sophocles called Philoctetes. I mean, it's not among Sophocles' greatest hits. It's not the Oedipus Tyrannus, but it's called Philoctetes, and it's a very interesting play. It's set in the Trojan War, and Philoctetes is a great archer, and he's bitten by a snake, and his wound festers so much that his comrades Ulysses and the others can't bear to have him on board the ship, and they maroon him on an island and abandon him. But then they go off and they discover they can't actually complete the mission, the sack of Troy, without the person they've rejected. That the bow of Philoctetes is necessary, and they try and cheat him with the bow, but then they realize they need to reconcile. Meantime, Philoctetes, of course, is very miserable and has, as it were, almost fallen in love with his own wound, and he needs to be redeemed by the return of his comrades from a kind of sort of mire of self-pity. So the play is about that. But Heaney specifically said, he wrote it for an Irish theatre company, the Field Day Theatre Company in 1990, that he hoped in the distant imagined mirror of this Greek tragedy, all those suffering, those abandoned by one, and outcast by one side of their community or other, those who thought they didn't need their neighbor, all those people might begin to see in this Greek story something that gave them a purchase and a hope on their own. And that proved to be dramatically the case, and particularly with one now very famous speech that the chorus, who kind of commentate on the play, say at the end when there has been a relaxation, a reconciliation of Philoctetes and Ulysses coming together. And the chorus suddenly lifts their eyes from the moment of the Greek tragedy and looks across the long arc of history. And although this is an Irish poet translating a Greek tragedy, and adding this extra speech into his own situation. That long arc of history, the arc that bends towards hope and redemption, is of course the great arc of the scriptural narrative too. So you will know this. In fact, various people involved in the peace negotiations began to recite this bit of poetry to each other. And in the end, the then President Clinton recited the whole thing as part of the ceremonies that led up to the signing of the Good Friday Peace Accord. Heaney also said that when he was writing this, he was filled with hope because of the release of Nelson Mandela, and that there was something of that going on in the poem as well. But let me read you the poem, and you should be able to see it on the screen as well. This is that chorus from Philoctetes. Human beings suffer. They torture one another. They get hurt and get hard. No poem or play or song can fully right a wrong inflicted and endured. So that's pretty much saying what Auden said, isn't it? Make something happen. But that's not the end of the poem any more than it was the end of Auden's. So here's how the poem goes on. The innocent in jails beat on their bars together. A hunger striker's father stands in the graveyard dumb. The police widow in veils faints at the funeral home. So those are people from the different sides, the hunger striker and the police widow. The poem sees their suffering and holds them each, both the opposed and the opposing, equally in the balance of human compassion. And then comes the famous passage that all the presidents quote. Here it comes. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. So, hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that a further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing wells. Call miracle self-healing, the utter self-revealing double take of feeling. If there's fire on the mountain or lightning and storm and a God speaks from the sky, that means someone is hearing the outcry and the birth cry of new life at its term. Oh, that last line is so brilliant because it's both the term, you come to the term, it's the term, the end of the poem, the term of the pregnancy, but the term is that it's precisely the giving birth to the new life. And there's so much here. That great sea change on the far side of revenge, the further shore is reachable. Well, he wrote that in 1990, and it was reachable. And we did get the Good Friday Accord. And far from poetry making nothing happen, this is really an example of the Shelleyan truth that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Because within a few years of Heaney writing this poem, quite literally, the legislators of the world had this poem on their lips because it said something that really needed to be said. It spoke into an intractable and deep and difficult situation, and it spoke a hope which, because it could be grasped, could also be enacted. So that seems to me to be Heaney himself in the redress of poetry, and in that wonderful chorus from The Cure at Troy, which was the title Heaney gave to his version of Philoctetes, The Cure at Troy. It seems to me that Heaney himself balances between, mediates, and in a sense fulfills the best of both what Shelley was saying on the one hand and what Auden was saying on the other. Now, in the final part of what I want to say on this poetry pushes back, and the sense of poetry having this life of its own and actually turning out to be more of a practical and genuinely life-changing help than we might at first realize. I thought I'd close, we're perhaps going from the sublime to the ridiculous, or certainly from the lofty to the middling, but I thought I would, because I can speak to it from my own experience and tell you about the difference between the process of writing the poem and what happens to the poem when it gets out there. I thought I'd conclude with a couple of short examples from my own life and experience as a poet. to address this fundamental question about whether poetry makes a difference and why we write poetry when the world is burning and all these, why poetry. I hope I've already answered that to some degree through Shelley and Auden and Heaney. But let me give you two examples, one from a little while back and one relating directly to where we are in this pandemic now, bringing us right up to date. So the first example is really quite a short and simple one. And it's about how even the poet doesn't know the full extent of what's going on in the poem and doesn't know what, if you like, what plans the poem has for itself, or what plans perhaps God has for the poem, which is different from the poet's original ideas. And that's partly why the poem is a living thing. It's, you know, so I once wrote a very short lyric, which I thought was so private that I wasn't even going to put it in one of my books. I was really hesitating. It has so happened that my father, a very close friend of my father, and exactly my father's age, a very old friend, died. And my father was himself pretty ill. And my father was going to his friend's funeral, and we all had a sense of my father's mortality. And I really wanted to go with my dad and sit with him to say goodbye to his friend. And at the last minute, an emergency occurred in my college. I mean, a really dire emergency with a student in danger. And I had to go straight back to college. But I was just, when I got this news, I was at lunch with a friend of mine, and my father was going to go to the funeral. And my friend said, "I'll take your dad." And as they disappeared around the corner, I just noticed as I was getting on my bike to go up to college that my friend had reached out and she was holding my father's hand. And I loved that so much that I wrote a short little poem called Holding and Letting Go. And I'll read it to you now, and you'll perhaps see why I thought it was just so. That's the second part of it. It starts with the words, "We have a call to live." That's the second verse, but don't worry. Here we are. There we go. Right. We have a call to live, and oh, a common call to die. I watched you and my father go to bid a friend goodbye. I watched you hold my father's hand. How could it not be so? The gentleness of holding on helps in the letting go. For when we feel our frailty, how can we not respond and reach to hold another's hand and feel the common bond? For then we touch the heights above and every depth below. We touch the very quick of love, holding and letting go. So it was a little poem, and I thought it was done. I wrote it on a card to my friend and sent it to her. And I thought it won't see the light of day. I just wanted to celebrate that moment. But I showed it to my wife, who also liked it. And she sent it to a friend, as it happened, in Vancouver. And the friend had another friend who worked in a hospice. And she gave it to her colleagues in the hospice, and they used to have a morning prayer every morning before they started their work and their ministry, one to another, and to the dying in the hospice. And unbeknownst to me, they read this poem, and every one of them said, "Oh, this is the very core of our philosophy. This is who we are and what we do. Who is the person who's written the hospice poem?" So I ended up getting an email from this hospice, which I knew nothing of, titled Hospice Poem, where they said, "We want to thank you for writing a poem about everything that hospices stand for, and we want your permission to be able to put it in our news sheet." And I thought, I don't even know what this poem is, but luckily they quoted it. And then I went back, let's just look at the poem again now and think about it, not as I wrote it on a card to my friend in Cambridge, but as it might be there hanging on the wall of a hospice. We have a call to live, and oh, a common call to die. I watched you and my father go to bid a friend goodbye. I watched you hold my father's hand. How could it not be so? The gentleness of holding on helps in the letting go. For when we feel our frailty, how can we not respond and reach to hold another's hand and feel the common bond? For then we touch the heights above and every depth below. We touch the very quick of love, holding and letting go. So I reread my poem, and I suddenly felt the poem being given back to me. And I subsequently had letters from the hospice, and I realised the poem was making a difference. It was enlarging, it was clarifying, it was giving me unapprehended thoughts. It was doing at least some of those things that Shelley said poetry should do. All unbeknownst to me, the poetry was wiser than I was. It knew something more than I did. And it went out there and did what it needed to do. And subsequently, it's become a poem that's quite often used at funerals. And again, I get letters from people who say this poem helped me to say what I needed to say, and I couldn't have said it myself. And not only that, it is helping me to do both the holding on and the cherishing of the memories and the letting go. And that seems to me to be a redress of poetry, a poetry, as it were, giving us a purchase, giving us a place to stand, allowing us to push back and at least hold the heavy weight of grief a little. So I'm going to finish what I have to say now with one final poem. I felt, because we are doing this on Zoom, because we're on YouTube, because we're in a crisis and we can't be together, I thought I should finish with a poem that arose specifically and directly out of this crisis. And again, it's a poem which kind of acquired a life of its own. So my poem is called Easter 2020, with a nod to Yeats's Easter 1916. And it was written on that, literally, I wrote it the night before Easter Sunday. I wrote it on Holy Saturday, appalled at the thought that we couldn't go to church, that the idea of being a Christian and not gathering with other Christians and not celebrating, for me, the Eucharist, the heart of it, you know. And I had to pass through the grief, which is, of course, what the disciples had to do on Good Friday and Holy Saturday anyway, of this loss of this familiar service. But then realized that my sense of the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the difference that makes to everything and everybody was as strong, if not stronger than ever. But I felt I needed to reuse the poem to ask the question that was on everybody's lips and to see if the poem and my faith would help me answer it. So let me read you the poem, and you can see it on the screen. Easter 2020. And where is Jesus this strange Easter day? Not lost in our locked churches, any more than he was sealed in that dark sepulchre. The locks are loosed, the stone is rolled away, and he is up and risen long before, alive, at large, and making his strong way into the world he gave his life to save. No need to seek him in his empty grave. He might have been a wafer in the hands of priests this day, or music from the lips of red-robed choristers. Instead, he slips away from church, shakes off our linen bands to don his apron with a nurse. He grips and lifts a stretcher, soothes with gentle hands the frail flesh of the dying, gives them hope, breathes with the breathless, lends them strength to cope. On Thursday, we applauded, for he came and served us in 1,000 names and faces, mopping our sick room floors and catching traces of that corona which was death to him. Good Friday happened in 1,000 places where Jesus held the helpless, died with them, that they might share his Easter in their need. Now they are risen with him, risen indeed. Now, I wrote that poem and I put it out that day, that Easter Sunday. I just put it up on my blog. And it had an extraordinary effect. It has had far more views than anything else I've ever put on my blog. And I began to get letters and messages, and one of them was from a nurse in a COVID ward, absolutely at the point of exhaustion, you know, full of all the, you know, the terrible choices, and you know, just the mask, just telling me that not only did she find herself there and find hope there, but that the fact that I said in the poem that it's Christ himself in her doing the work, that he's with her and in her, because that's how Christ works, had actually not only strengthened her, but reconnected and renewed her faith. And I just, you know, I was amazed that this was a poem making an actual difference to. But then another thing happened to the poem, which was that it was widely shared. And I had a letter from a theologian and great biblical scholar whom I know little and deeply admire, Tom Wright, N.T. Wright. And he had felt called to help the church think through this pandemic theologically. He noticed that a lot of new atheists were using it for a bit of cheap rhetoric of the kind of "where is now your God," which needed to be answered. But equally, he felt many Christians struggling, and so he was working overtime. He's an amazing man. He can on a little book called "God and the Pandemic," which is now out and is a superb book. But he began to feel as he wrote it that precisely the very things that Shelley was saying, that we need our imagination, that we need, as it were, the veil lifted. We need some poetry to help us grapple with these problems just as much as reason. And he'd come across that poem, Easter 2020, and he wrote and asked me if he could use it. And I said, yeah, feel free to quote it. And he said, no, I want to include the entire poem. And he brings the whole poem in towards the end of the book. And therefore it becomes another thing. It's one thing that it's a poem read by an exhausted nurse. It's another thing that then the poem says, well, actually, I want to have a long conversation with the theologian. It's poetry, not theology, but there's a theology implicit in it. And so a conversation begins, which is really one little bit of the long conversation we all need to have in our culture between reason and imagination. Reason and imagination have been divorced from one another. We need to bring them together again. And poetry can speak on behalf of imagination, but in a way to which reason has access and can be part of that conversation. And that is part of the redress, part of the pushback, part of the gift that poetry itself has to offer us, if we're willing to accept it.
Thanks so much, Malcolm, for that excellent lecture. Just really wonderful. And I want to thank all of you out there who joined us today. I hear that we had a bit of a rocky start with the technology, so thank you for sticking with us. We are so glad you're here, and I'm happy to let you know that most of what you missed was my introduction, not Malcolm's lecture. So thank the Lord for those small mercies. Since we missed that introduction, I'm going to give a bit of a recap now. And while I'm doing that, if you have questions for Malcolm, please direct them to questions@regent-college.edu. We've got a few questions from folks who've been watching, but please feel free to send some more that way to questions@regent-college.edu. And we'll take the next 20 or 30 minutes for discussion.
That's great.
So while you're sending those questions in, I just want to let you know that today's lecture is part of the Ideas That Matter series, which is an online series hosted by Regent College. The Ideas That Matter series cultivates theological engagement in cultural issues that are particularly relevant right now. As you've probably discerned from listening to Malcolm's lecture, today we're asking about the value of the arts in a time of crisis. So why do poetry and literature matter when the world seems to be burning around us? Why should we pay attention to poets when there are significant needs at every turn? We've been delighted to have a very real life poet with us today telling us about that. And so we've been privileged to be exploring those issues with Dr. Malcolm Geit. I see from the chat on the YouTube channel that many of you already know Malcolm and are big fans, which is wonderful to see. Malcolm is a poet, priest, and scholar who is giving thought to these important questions and who serves as chaplain of Girton College in Cambridge, a teacher at the Divinity Faculty in Cambridge, and a lecturer who speaks widely in England and North America. We're looking forward to a new book of poetry from Malcolm at the end of January, which is called David's Crown and is written in response to the Psalms. So watch for that book, published by Canterbury Press at the end of January. All right, so thanks to those of you who send in questions. We're just going to start that conversation. Again, please feel free to keep on sending them in to questions@regent-college.edu. Malcolm, I want to start with drawing on that conversation about Sophocles and Philoctetes. Am I saying that right? Yes, Philoctetes. So you use the language of Philoctetes waiting alone on the island, fallen in love with his own wound. Right now, we're in a time when a lot of us are alone, and there can be a tendency, I know for me and for some of those around me, towards melancholy that can descend into pessimism or depression. So I was wondering if you could reflect on sometimes poetry and art meditates on wounding in a way that heals, but sometimes it does so in a way that sort of sustains and reinflicts the wound. So could you give us some information on how do we become discerning readers? How do we cultivate a practice of reading that heals instead of inflicting?
That's a very, very good question. I wonder whether the phrase that sometimes is used medically, but a surgeon might do this, of searching a wound will help here. Because there are two perils here. There's the sort of peril of the practical people that want everybody to cheer up and get on with it and, be robust and all of that, and who minimize, who say peace, peace when there's no peace, who don't understand how deeply hurt and wounded a person might be, and particularly through this lockdown and the way an underlying melancholy or depression might. So that person just plastering it over and telling everybody to get on is going to do no good at all. The thing is going to fester within, and that's part of what happens literally with Philoctetes' wounds. But obviously the danger then is to say, okay, no, let's open this up and look at it, is that you can go down so deep that you can't get out again. And there's a certain kind of lugubrious kind of bad art that does that. I mean, there's a very fine throwaway line of, well, not throwaway, I mean, a great line of Dylan's in his song, It's All Right, Ma, I'm Only Bleeding, which I always imagine as being sung by Christ on the cross, especially as it begins with darkness at the break of noon. But that has a thing about, it says, one who sings with his tongue on fire, bent out of shape by society's pliers, cares not to come up any higher, but rather gets you down in the hole that he's in. And there is a kind of imaginative art that might do that to you and not take you out anywhere else. But that's not what most imaginative art does. In fact, for some people, just expressing it, just to feel that their feelings have been expressed by somebody, even if there's not an apparent resolution in the art, gives them a purchase. It's just that somebody's spoken it, that they're not alone. Somebody else has felt that too. I mean, I remember reading my friend Gwyneth Lewis, who suffers deeply from depression. She wrote a book, a prose book. She's a poet, but she wrote a book called Sunbathing in the Rain, a cheerful book about depression. And I was just so glad when she described how appalling depression was, that actually somebody else knew what, that they'd put it in words. And you feel that way with the Psalms as well. Your Psalm 88 is not a happy psalm, and there's no yet or nevertheless in Psalm 88. But in the bigger frame of the book of Psalms, Psalm 88 is actually incredibly healing because it searches the wound. It actually goes right down to the bottom of it, and finds the sting, Now, the other Psalms draw the sting out. So I don't think you can have an art. I don't think there can be healing and helpful art unless it's willing to be real about what suffering is. So I would err on the side, frankly, of it giving expression to the melancholia and then wait for the larger thing to pick it up. It's rather like what the theologian Karl Barth said about Mozart's music, which he loved. He said, we accept the yes, the enormous yes at the core of Mozart's music, because it contains and overcomes a no. Because so that would be something of what I'd say, I think, to that.
That's awesome. Thank you. We have a question also from Christina. She says, she refers back to your reference to Shelley, where he says the great instrument of moral good is the imagination, and everything depends on how you combine love and imagination. Yeah. So she's got a question about a very specific application. She says, what are some ways we can cultivate imagination in a multicultural congregation, especially when you've got a wide variety of language backgrounds? And so maybe, poetry can be challenging when you've got a lot of ESL or just a lot of diversity in language. So how can we use poetry to cultivate imagination in that space?
Thanks. So it's a very good question. Just to go back to the Shelley, of course, what he does say, the imagination, he starts actually by saying that the great secret of morals is love. And then he goes on to show that the imagination comes to the aid of love, because loving involves going out from yourself into the other. Right. So we need to keep love in there as well. So first of all, going back to the multicultural situation and the helping with your neighbors, love is a universal language. Somebody, you may not share your language or your cultural assumptions or anything, can basically tell whether you're loving. They can tell whether you mean them good. And so love is a huge precursor to all of these things. obviously poetry is a language bound thing. I mean, some people have defined poetry as that which cannot be translated, you know. But having said that, obviously, The Cure at Troy is a translation. It's a loose version. It's a remaking in Irish English of a Greek play. So in the very act of translation, something new and creative is happening. And I think some of the most exciting things culturally happen precisely in, as it were, mixed neighborhoods, we still allow this to happen. It's precisely when, you know, I mean, to think of an example from my own late teens and early 20s, I was living briefly in a bit of London where there were a lot of Jamaicans, and the reggae scene was just incredible. And there were all these sound systems, this was in the 70s, and it was just unbelievable. And they were singing the Psalms, you know, and bits of the Book of Revelation. And I had absolutely, you know, I was vaguely familiar. And I started hanging out at these things and hearing Rastas. I mean, obviously Rastafarianism is a different faith from Christianity, but it has a huge amount. Obviously, it's got quite a lot scripturally in common. And hearing these Rastas telling me, you know, at one point, you know, trying to say, you know, you've got to know and understand Almighty God is a living man. I think, blimey, you know. And, so in a sense, I was given back something precisely in the cross-cultural encounter, you know.
Yeah, thank you for that. Just going to check in. We've got a question from Pamela that I think builds on this. So she says, thanks so much for sharing. Besides reading poetry or other literature, you're a priest, so not just a poet. Poetry and literature can sometimes be a stretch in our culture, even in our church culture. But what are other ways that the imagination of communities and individuals can be reconstructed or reborn? Are there other paths that you would also recommend?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I think I'd want to talk about storytelling in every form, by which I don't mean, you know, having the time and the skill to write War and Peace, you know. I don't mean, you know, your great unpublished novel. I mean, literally telling kids stories around the dinner table, listening to the story your neighbor has to tell about the old man down the street, not, you know, asking older people to talk about their earlier lives. As soon as we have narrative, the imagination is at work, not because we're making up the story, or we might embroider details, mightn't we? But it's the very act of seeing the narrative thread, the very act of telling our story in such a way that we realize it really is a story and we're part of it, is a work of imagination. And then, of course, one of the most powerful things you can possibly do if you listen to somebody else's story, and their story from their perspective is a story without God. It's a story of abandonment or of lostness or loneliness. And you can hear their story powerfully enough, both to respect and resonate with every element of it, but perhaps to help that person discern that there's another angle to their story. So the classic example of that, set within a story itself, is at the end of The Horse and His Boy, when Shasta's walking with this unknown other, you know, and he says, who are you? And he says, one who's waited long for you to speak. Tell me your story. And Shasta tells his story about having been, brought up by the fishermen and run away and lonely in the tombs, and a cat came and a lion attacked. And the other voice says, you were never alone. I was the cat that walked through the tombs. I was the lion that came. I was there. And so it's not that it's Shasta's whole story. It's still his story, but it's completely reframed, and it redeems him, because people can get trapped in a bad story. They can get trapped in a story in which they're always the loser. And you can help someone reframe their own story, but to do so requires a great act of imagination.
I love that. That's one of my favorite passages from C.S. Lewis. Makes me cry every time. Thank you. Ivan says, he's talking about kind of how our collective imagination is shaped as a culture, but he says, I'm thinking of Oscar Wilde's quip that all bad poetry springs from genuine feeling. So he says there is a sentiment in culture that rages against the very idea of a canon, or against the idea that some poetry is worth pursuing, but not all artistic expression is on the same level. So I think this connects to your comments about like, how do we do storytelling in ways that are or are not professional? He says, is canon a valid concept? Or is there an alternative and more eclectic line through which we can begin to intuit that new way of seeing, to have a bit of that glimpse?
Okay, thanks, Ivan. So that's both a kind of practical question and a literary question. I mean, there's a great literary controversy, as you know, about what is canon. And canon, of course, simply means measure or rule. And I mean, in some respects, the idea of a canon of scripture, in the sense that time has filtered some stuff out and that here's a bunch of stuff that you know is really good, simply as to save you just picking up a whole bunch of, stuff that turns out not to be very helpful from anywhere. Canon as measure or rule or guide is quite a useful concept, but of course it's double-edged. And the thing that is clear is that canon, what is canonical in good literature, is always decided by people with power and influence, and never decided by people without power and influence. And therefore, great things done by people without power and influence are overlooked. Except, fortunately, there are so many revolutions in both social and literary modes that you always get a readjustment of the canon. So canon is useful for certain things on a positive level. What canon is bad at is where people say, I may not ever read anything outside of this canon, and then you're stuck, and then you have blinkered vision. But of course, if we're talking about the practical question of how the imaginative arts can enable our loving, if the great secret of morals is love and the great enabler of love is the imagination, and we're talking here about poetry, then we don't have to, we couldn't care tuppence whether a literary critic says this is great or not great. And we can be free to discover poetry in many voices from many different places. And we're not going to ask the question, how good is it? Obviously, Oscar Wilde is having a go at the idea of the poet who just gushes and thinks that because he felt it, I've got to feel it too. And it's very embarrassing when there is some gushy poetry that is just embarrassing and was very good therapy for the poet at the time they wrote it, but isn't really, as Seamus Heaney says somewhere in advice to someone, don't let the veins in your biro bulge, So poetry does require, poetry is kind of second thoughts in a way. It's as Wordsworth famously said, it's emotion recollected in tranquility. And you need both the tranquility and the distance and the skill to do it well. And broadly speaking, if I'm going to teach a course on literature, I'd rather fill it with poems by poets who actually have the skill and did have the time and have got the wisdom. And so I like canon, though I'll always bring new things into it. Mm-hmm. But if I'm in a church or a community or a neighborhood or an AA meeting or something like that, I'm going to use whatever comes to my mind, which might be the lyrics of a pop song or it might be a piece of Homer. If it says the right thing in the right way and opens somebody's eyes, then it's great.
That's awesome. I'm wondering, are there poets writing now? So you talk about people who have tranquility and distance and skill. This isn't a great time for distance or tranquility, but is there anybody who's, apart from yourself, is there anybody who's doing this well right now that you would recommend check out?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I mentioned briefly, sort of tangentially in the talk, Gwyneth Lewis, who's been National Poet of Wales. I mean, she is a superb poet. She's very good at the fraught and the dark. She's got a collection of poems, several of her books brought together, with the wonderful title Chaotic Angels. And it's great. She's good both on angels and chaos, and when they meet in our minds. So Chaotic Angels, I mean, it's not always an easy read, but it's always a rewarding read. So Gwyneth Lewis, on your side of the Atlantic, obviously you've got Scott Cairns. I mean, he's superb. Idiot Psalms, that's an amazing book. You've got Lucy Shaw. I mean, Scott and Lucy are at different ends of things. They're both great poets. I'm very fortunate. You've got an opposite Regent. You all know Lucy. But Lucy, like in her 90s now, is still writing really, really good poetry. It's amazing if you follow her on Facebook or anything, you get these new poems. And obviously she's writing with the wisdom of age and also with the perspective of increasing if you like, disability, that she can do less and less. So I'm finding her poetry incredibly helpful in the lockdown, because it's seeing the newness and the beauties of the smaller focus, you know. So and if you guys have got, and of course North America, there's Wendell Berry as well, so he's incredible. I would also seriously look to the musicians for poetry, because, you know, when poetry became sort of all free verse and concrete poetry and stuff, and people who wanted to have this sense of rhythm and rhyme, which I love and use, quite often just moved off the page and onto the album, you know. And so I would regard, well, look, talking about the ones, the heroes of my generation, I would regard obviously Leonard Cohen and Dylan as poets of the first order. But I think, you know, Josh Ritter and Sufjan Stevens, and for me, I would say the band Over the Rhine, I would regard all their lyrics simply as lyrics, let alone what beautiful things are. I would regard those two, you know, Karen and Linford, as poets of the first order.
That's really helpful. Thanks. Mike in Pennsylvania has a more specific question, which is, do you have poems that you read each year during Advent? Or do you have something different? I know that you yourself have written an Advent sort of cycle, which I've got on my shelf, but I'm wondering if you could tell us about some poems that you typically read in the season.
Yeah, well, I do. I did put an Advent anthology together called Waiting on the Word, which literally has a poem for every day. They're not all mine, they're from all over the place. It starts with Christina Rossetti's brilliant poem Advent Sunday. So I actually used that myself. I chose those poems because they were already poems that I used in Advent and liked. But sometimes there are particular poets that I kind of will use a period like Advent or Lent to soak myself in. I only give one Christina Rossetti poem, I think, at the beginning of that. But Christina Rossetti's sort of devotional poetry, well, all her poetry is good, but her devotional poetry is very powerful, I think. And she was very inspired by George Herbert and wrote quite a few poems about the Christian seasons. I mean, all of that has been sort of almost airbrushed out of the account of her in secular literary historians like Christina Rossetti, because she's a strong woman in the 19th century. So she's got to be, you know, up there. But then they don't like her because she's just incredibly strongly Christian. So they kind of, you know, sort of fade that out. So Christina Rossetti is somebody I quite often go back to. I very often go back to George Herbert. Anything by George Herbert is going to help you, you know, at any time of year. There is, in fact, a poem by W.H. Auden called Christmas Oratorio, I think it is, which has got a series of reflections on the Christmas story, and that makes pretty good Advent reading too.
That's wonderful. We're coming to the end of our questions. I'm going to leave a few minutes. If you have a question, please send it to questions@regent-college.edu. That's questions@regent-college.edu. And Malcolm, before we close up on that, I'm wondering if you could speak to, what is it, we're talking about poetry pushing back, but what are you pushing back against right now in your life as you're dealing with the lockdown, as you're looking at the world around you? What are some of the things that you're really noticing and feeling in yourself and responding to as you write and as you make music and study?
That's how long have you got?
We have 20 minutes.
No. I mean, I'm just thinking about the number of things that one might. I mean, I guess it was a curious. The first lockdown was a very extraordinary experience. Ours was quite intense. You know, it was like one night the Prime Minister just came on and said, "Stay at home." It was just like that. And, you know, you could only go out for an hour a day to exercise, and only once, and, you know, one person by yourself. And it was very strict lockdown. And so after the initial shock, I actually started, of course, in one way, like what's not to like about that? You know, a poet, you're training, I've got a little hut in my garden. Suddenly my diary is completely clear. So I started sort of to enjoy it. And then I felt guilty about enjoying it. Because gradually, as you went through it, you began to realize this is very serious. And then I began to find myself we would listen to the numbers of the dying rising every day. And I must admit, that was something I needed to, not to push back against, but to hold up. I felt I couldn't not feel the weight of that. And funnily enough, the thing I turned to was a book by John Donne, which he wrote during the plague in the 17th century when he stayed in London and didn't go off, and escape it, and became ill himself. It's called Devotions on Emergent Occasions. And it's where the famous passage comes from, do not send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee, it tolls for every man, it tolls for me, any man's death diminishes me, for I'm involved in humanity, and no man is an island completed itself. Everyone is a part of the main. That whole passage comes from that book, and it's full of things like that. So I began to find I needed poetry by other poets and poetry that I could write myself, which enabled me to do that, to hold that weight, knowing that Christ holds it too, but not to ignore it, not to say, well, I'm okay in my little corner of England, there's not much plague here, I'm just inconvenienced by not being able to go to the shops. I somehow felt there was a vocation to hold it, but then that required both the imagination and courage and love. And then I began reading the Psalms, of course, and I realized the Psalms. So I had two poetic projects during this thing. One was a thing called Quarantine Quatrains, which I wrote as a fundraiser for care workers, which I completed in the very early in the lockdown. And then I began this massive project, which actually kept me sane, I think, where I would really read deep into the Psalms and meditate on a psalm, and then write a poem responding to that psalm, and then the next psalm. And that the Psalms are so uninhibited. They're so honest about how bad you feel about things. They're so angry in places. They completely remove the polish of English restraint and politeness. And every so often you need to do that. So I actually felt, the Psalms became both a poetic and a biblical resource, and remain so for me. Because I think the thing you have to really grasp is that for most of us who survive, this is a kind of a period we'll remember as a historical thing we went through together, and we'll talk about it, and eventually we'll laugh about it. And, how Zoom worked, and you're still on mute. But for many people among our friends and neighbors, life will have changed irrevocably through lost jobs and bereavement. And we have to find a way of imaginatively being with and sustaining those people.
We have actually two questions that came in that are similar, and I think build on that. So both of them are about children. So how do we, they're similar, so I'm just going to read the one. She says, what are some starter poems for children, or what are some works that can help children cultivate an imagination around the hard things of the world, like pandemics? How can they help children approach those things well, bringing together both the rational awareness and also that imaginative hope?
Great. Okay, well, the first thing to say is I think that classic fairy stories are great because they have dragons and ogres and monsters, and they have giants, but they also have Jack the Giant Killer. So they have the threat, and they have the hero, and they have the courage. And those are imaginative and symbolic ways of talking to children about all the bad things in this world, so actually go with those. But in terms of poetry, I do think, that poetry belongs to childhood, and that we should read poems with strong rhythm and rhyme. And children actually love rhyme and love strong rhythm. And there are a number of good sort of children's anthologies, depending on how young they are. I mean, Robert Louis Stevenson wrote a fine book of poetry for quite young children called A Child's Garden of Verses, which obviously is old-fashioned now. It's by Robert Louis Stevenson, but it's still very. I still remember poems from that. There's a bit about the excitement of being in a train, for example, that goes, and the way everything goes whistling past you on the train. So it goes faster than fairies, faster than witches, bridges and houses, hedges and ditches, and charging along like troops in a battle all through the meadows, the horses and cattle. You got the rhythm of the train, and it's great fun. I also remember one by Alfred Noyes called The Highwayman, which had this. It's a wonderful ghost story, but it's got this chorus that goes, the highwayman came riding. The highwayman came riding up to the old inn door. So you need all that kind of stuff. If kids are a bit older and they want something really quite thought-provoking but still accessible to them, there's a fantastic anthology of poetry put together by Seamus Heaney and Ted Hughes, which is a great combination, and it's called The Rattle Bag. And they've got one more for younger kids called The School Bag, I think, but The Rattle Bag, which was meant to be like a bag, you rattle it open, you take another poem out of it. So those are the ones I would recommend.
Thank you so much. That's helpful. I'm looking for Christmas presents for my nephews, so this will be a good little tip.
Yeah.
Malcolm, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. We really appreciate this reflection on how it is that we can engage with the arts in helpful ways and in ways that are healing rather than destructive for us. So thanks for giving us your time. We're really grateful for it. Am I right in thinking that you're going to be teaching with us next summer as well?
I am, yes. In
Okay.
fact, I'm going to hopefully bring to you the fruit of my long reflections on the Psalms and do a course on the Psalms, but also using these new poems as a way of opening them out.
That is wonderful. So if you're interested in learning with Malcolm, we should have our full summer website up in early January. So you can check that out, find out what it is that you can learn with Malcolm at Regent next summer. You can find that at rgnt.net/summer. So rgnt.net/summer. And don't forget to look out for Malcolm's new book on the Psalms coming out in January from Canterbury Press, which is called David's Crown. So don't miss that. Malcolm, thanks again for your time. It's been just a joy to be with you, and we hope that you have a wonderful evening.
Okay, thank you very much, and goodbye to everybody, and thank you all for joining us, wherever you might be.
Thank you.
Thanks, then. Bye.